The year that I'm publishing this episode is 2025. In fact, we're nearing the end of 2025. It's a year of Jubilee when Catholics are especially encouraged to take a pilgrimage, particularly to Rome if they're able. Pilgrimages have long been an important tradition of Catholicism, and one of the most important destinations for pilgrims is the Holy Land. However, for most of history, that wasn't easy. In fact, given the constant political unrest in the Holy Land, it still isn't exactly easy. During the Middle Ages, a pilgrimage to the Holy Land was anything but a walk in the park. There weren't airplanes, trains, or cars. A pilgrimage could take months, maybe even years on foot or horseback. There was an ever-shifting political landscape, including nomadic tribes, and some of them, like the Tatars, were vicious. The Holy Land itself was in constant unrest. By the time one arrived there, they had no idea what they might find. Would it be under Christian control or Muslim rule? Would the Muslims even allow Christian pilgrims, or would they be immediately imprisoned or killed? A pilgrimage to the Holy Land was perilous and expensive. One would need to buy food and lodging along the way, and being that this was before the time of credit cards, that meant that one would have to carry around a significant amount of gold or currency for their journey. Knowing this, opportune thieves would lurk around pilgrim paths. Others might not rob the pilgrims, but instead convince them that they needed to pay a toll to cross a bridge or to have safe passage through a particular tract of land. The Catholic Church recognized these pervasive perils that face pilgrims, and so they established military orders to protect pilgrims on their journeys. One of them was the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar. Founded in 1119 by the French knight Hugh de Payenne, the Knights Templar was headquartered on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. However, being that it was founded by a French knight, a lot of Templar activities focused in France. One of the processes that the Knights Templar set up to protect pilgrims was an intricate banking system. Pilgrims could deposit valuables that they needed for the journey at one Templar location, then travel to another location and withdraw their money, and thus they wouldn't have to worry about being robbed of all their money along the road. This banking system became the basis for our modern banks. However, not everyone was supportive of the Knights Templar, particularly King Philip IV of France. A series of politically charged events led to the persecution of the Knights Templar and eventually the Council of Vienne. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode in our series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils. This Council of Vienne, not Vienna, by the way, is certainly not as famous as many of the other councils. And so if you're listening, either it's because you've been following along in this series, or you specifically found this episode because you wanted to learn more about this very council. Whatever your reasons for listening, I want to offer a heartfelt thank you. Please keep in mind that the Why Catholic podcast is founded by 100% of your donations. Anything that you can do to support this podcast financially goes a long way. To give financially, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe, where you can become a monthly or an annual donor. Thank you so much for your generosity. As I always do, I want to set the context for this episode, and I want to begin with Pope Celestine V. He was a deeply spiritual monk who was elected in July of 1294. He was known as the Angel Pope, likely because of his gentle and spiritual demeanor, but what he was unprepared for was the political gamesmanship involved with the papacy. At this time, England and France were at war, and to fund their military campaigns, they were taxing the churches and the clergy. The churches desperately needed the Pope to stand up to these political bullies, and Pope Celestine was just not the man to do that. So in December of 1294, just 5 months into his papacy, he declared that popes had a right to resign, and then he promptly resigned. By the way, the next uncontested pope to resign was Pope Benedict XVI in 2013. The church then elected Pope Boniface VIII, who ironically was one who encouraged Pope Celestine to resign. Pope Boniface, unlike his predecessor, was up to the political tasks facing the papacy, and boy, were there a number. In England, this was the time of King Edward I, also known as Longshanks. He's depicted in the movie Braveheart. But the real political thorn in the Pope's side was King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair. I've mentioned many times in the series about the tension between the church and state. This was no exception. King Philip IV was very public about his feeling that the King of France was not under the authority of the Pope, and to prove it, He levied taxes on the clergy and prevented French clergymen from traveling to Rome. Pope Boniface, in turn, excommunicated King Philip. Eventually, Pope Boniface VIII issued the papal bull known as Unum Sanctum, meaning one holy, as in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, in which he declared that all political leaders were subject to the Pope. In fact, he said that this was a matter of salvation. That was unconvincing to King Philip, who sent an army to abduct the 73-year-old pontiff. Pope Boniface was severely beaten, probably within an inch of his life. However, he was released 3 days later, but the traumatic event took such a physical toll on him that he died a month later. The College of Cardinals wanted to elect someone who could lower the temperature with King Philip IV, and so they chose Niccolò Boccassini, who was previously the Master General of the Dominicans. He took on the name of Pope Benedict XI, and Pope Benedict quickly removed the excommunication of King Philip, but he excommunicated anyone who had a part in kidnapping his predecessor. Pope Benedict XI would die just 8 months into his pontificate, but one of his accomplishments was negotiating a truce between King Philip IV of France and King Edward I of England. Following Pope Benedict XI's death in 1304, the College of Cardinals elected Raymond Bertrand de Got, a Frenchman, a personal friend of King Philip, and the Archbishop of Bordeaux. He wasn't a cardinal, and he wasn't present when the College of Cardinals voted for him. He was, of course, living in France at the time, and after his election, in which he took on the name of Pope Clement V, he never moved to Rome. He stayed in France, and that became the start of a tumultuous history of the Catholic Church known as the Avignon Papacy, where 7 successive popes of French origin resided in Avignon, now located in southern France, rather than going to Rome. More on the Avignon Papacy in the next episode. Whereas Pope Boniface VIII took an aggressive stance against King Philip IV, Pope Clement V essentially did the opposite. He withdrew Pope Boniface's papal bull known as Unum Sanctum, basically signaling to the world that he didn't see secular rulers as being subject to the Roman pontiff. I opened this episode talking about the Knights Templar, and they play an important role in this story. You see, the Knights were a Catholic military order, and as such, they didn't pay any taxes. With the waning of the Crusades, the Knights Templar weren't really that active in the Holy Land. A lot of them had gained significant wealth and land, and particularly in France, and Philip IV was in debt to them because of money he borrowed to pay for his military campaign against England. He also saw the Templars as a prime revenue source, and so he waged a propaganda war against them. He falsely accused them of all sorts of things, from heresy to sodomy to corruption to fraud. Pope Clement V sent letters to both the Grand Knights of the Templars and the Hospitallers. The Knights Hospitallers were also a Catholic military order in charge of protecting the Holy Land. Pope Clement proposed that the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitallers merge into one Catholic order. The Grand Knights discussed this matter with Pope Clement, but they also discussed some of the crimes they were being accused of. King Philip increased the pressure on the Knights Templar, and on Friday, October 13, 1307, King Philip arrested scores of members of the Knights Templar, including the Grand Knight Jacques de Molay. The arrest warrants began with, quote, "God is not pleased. We have enemies of the faith in the kingdom," end quote. The knights were accused of all sorts of things, like initiating practices where they had to spit on the cross or kiss other men in the order. Many of the knights, under coercion and torture, confessed to the accusations. And being that this occurred on Friday, October 13th, this is where we get the whole superstition of Friday the 13th. King Philip demanded that Pope Clement initiate the systemic arrest of all Knights Templars, and so under Philip's pressure, Clement issued a papal bull instructing all monarchs to arrest members of the order and seize their assets. Other members of the Knights Templar came to France to aid their fellow knights. Fair trials were impeded, of course, by King Philip IV, and many were sentenced to burn at the stake in Paris. Philip pressured Pope Clement to disband the group altogether, and under the threat of military action, Pope Clement convened the Council of Vienne on October 16, 1311, in Vienne, France, not Vienna, Austria. The 15th General or Ecumenical Council began with about 20 cardinals, 4 patriarchs, about 100 archbishops and bishops, and a number of abbots and priors. Council records, while very few, actually vary extensively on the number of attendees at the Council of Vienne, and there were reports that King Philip had heavy control of the invite list. The Pope had asked invitees to come with a list of reforms. And like in previous councils, the Pope opened up the council with a sermon. In this case, Pope Clement V listed 3 primary concerns: the Knights Templar, the Holy Land, and church reforms. There were a number of smaller committees that formed to investigate the matter of the Knights Templar, and after examining the evidence, by December, the council had overwhelmingly decided no evidence against them rose to any level of some sort of smoking gun, and so the Templars ought to be given the right to defend themselves in court. However, that was not good enough for King Philip IV. He showed up to Vienna in February of 1312 and demanded that the Pope take action against the Knights Templar, and so instead of a council decision, Pope Clement V issued a number of papal bulls accusing the Templars of committing evil and illegal acts and officially disbanding them. And this is rather unique. As we've seen in previous councils, the council as a whole makes a decision. But in this case, it's the Pope issuing a papal bull and unilaterally deciding on the matter, independent of the council's wishes. Now, the whole idea of a council, whether it's more regional or a larger ecumenical council, is to get buy-in from a larger contingency. The Pope, as the absolute monarch of the Church, can make unilateral decisions. He could, for instance, wake up one day and say, I want to rewrite our canon law. Or I want to combine the Dominicans and the Franciscans into a single order. Or he could weigh in on a particular controversial matter like ordaining women. And at times, the Pope does issue various documents ranging from encyclicals to pastoral exhortations to papal bulls. By the way, in the show notes, I have a breakdown of the various types of papal documents and the weight each one has. So the fact that a Pope issued a papal bull disbanding the Knights Templar isn't that big of a deal. However, the fact that he did it while a council was in session is sort of like a spit in the face of the council. It's like, you're all here, you're all weighing in on this decision, and I'm just going to override you anyways and make a unilateral decision. It's clear that Pope Clement V was a puppet of King Philip, and he wouldn't be the first. There's going to be a long history of French control over the papacy, which we'll discuss in the next episode on the Avignon Papacy. Pope Clement V issued 3 papal bulls over the course of the Council of Vienne pertaining to dissolving the Knights Templar and seizing their assets, and he did this on March 22nd, May 2nd, and May 6th of 1312. In the council session held on May 6, a letter was read from King Philip IV, promising to lead the efforts of a new crusade within 6 years, and should he die before that time, his eldest son was to lead the expedition. To pay for the crusade, a 6-year tithe or tax was imposed. I mentioned a little earlier that Pope Clement V asked attendees to bring reform ideas to the council. The challenge with this council is that we really don't know all of the council discussions regarding these reforms. It appears as though the ideas were collected and sorted into 2 categories: improvement of morals and protection of the independence of the church, ironically. And then decisions were issued 5 years later as a set of laws. With that said, in addition to the matter of the Knights Templar and the pending crusade, here are some of the decisions attributed to this council. Regarding controversial religious groups known as the Beguines and Begards, the council disavowed them as a religious order, since they seemed to lack obedience, poverty, and acceptance of any rule. It condemned many of their practices and teachings as heretical. The council issued a constitution on the doctrine of the soul, defining that the rational soul is the true and essential form of the human body, rejecting dualistic interpretations. And this clarified Catholic anthropology against teachings that separated intellect from personal individuality. Like previous councils, this one issued a strong condemnation against usury, the lending of money with high interest, reaffirming it as a grave sin and condemning civil laws which permitted it. Rulers who defended usury risked ecclesiastical penalties, including excommunication. Universities were mandated to establish chairs in Hebrew, Greek, Arabic, and Chaldean to aid biblical scholarship and missionary activity. This aimed to strengthen preaching, apologetics, and engagement with non-Christian cultures. We're approaching the time of the Spanish Inquisition, and this might be the most famous Inquisition, but in reality, there were already inquisitorial practices happening in various countries. The council regulated inquisitorial practice to ensure greater procedural fairness and episcopal oversight. It sought to curb abuses while maintaining that the church had the authority to prosecute heresy. Lastly, the council weighed in on clerical discipline and reform, exhorting the clergy to moral reform, simplicity of life, and faithful fulfillment of pastoral duties. Let's talk about the aftermath of this 15th Ecumenical Council, the Council of Vienne. The council was clouded with an air of suspicion. It was pretty clear that King Philip IV was calling the shots. A Parisian chronicler, John of Saint Victor, even stated, quote, "It was said by many that the council was created for the purpose of extorting money," end quote. That was certainly the case with respect to the Crusades. Even though King Philip IV promised to lead the efforts within 6 years, it never happened. All of the taxes were collected, given to the king, and he used it in his war against the Flanders. I've mentioned over and over in this series how throughout the course of history, we can see this tug of war between the church and the state. So many of these councils were formed to counteract some of the political influence. And here we see the church take a whole different approach. Instead of trying to counterbalance the French government and King Philip's powerful influence, Pope Clement V essentially handed the church over to the king. As for the Knights Templar, many of them met a horrific end. Members were coerced to confess, and later, many of them retracted their confession. The Grand Knight, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris on March 18, 1314. He reportedly asked to face the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and amidst the flames declared that Pope Clement and King Philip would meet him before God. Pope Clement V died only a month later, and King Philip IV died within the same year. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.